every vacation you take or trip you take, you want to know where you're going. So if we're going to hammer a saw, first thing I need to know is where am I trying to get to? What does the finished product look like? Then, armed with that knowledge, we'll check a saw and try to see where it deviates from what a properly hammered saw looks like and plan out a strategy to get it to look like what a properly hammered saw looks like. So we're going to start with a saw that has been hammered, and we're going to check it, and I'm going to show you what a properly hammered saw looks like. Anytime you have a saw in your hands, you should always give it a shake. And you'll feel there's just a little bit of movement in the eye of the saw. And you'll feel that depending on how much RPM the mill is running and how much tension you need to put in the saw, that shake will feel a little different. So right now I'm going to put the saw on the test arbor. This, by the way, is a test arbor that's leveled to a machinist level. And the collars are machined to be really right on. So I'm going to set the dial indicator up against the rim of the saw. And I'm going to zero it out. And then I'm going to tighten the nut from hand tight to wrench tight. I don't get carried away with it, but I tighten it. And I take note, did it move on the dial indicator at all? This one moved about 1/1000th, and that's okay. Reason I do that, if the collars are bad, when you tighten the nut from hand tight to wrench tight, it'll move the rim quite a lot. You could also have a situation in good collars where there could be a lump inside the collar area that when you tighten the nut could move the rim of the saw. So that's just an additional check I do. Another check I do, I just touch this way, and as long as the needle moves that way, as long as this moves the same direction as this, that means we have what we call positive tension, and I'll explain that later. If we had negative tension, less than 0, when I move the rim towards the board side here, this side would move this way, and that would tell me it's got negative tension. So now what I'm going to do is zero out the indicator to measure how much the saw wobbles. One might say, what do you mean your saw wobbles? I thought I brought it to you to have the wobble removed. Well, every saw wobbles some. Question is, what is an acceptable amount of wobble? And the answer to that is, for saws 48 to 60 inches in diameter, acceptable amount of wobble is plus or minus 15 thousandths or better. So that would be a total overall wobble of 30 thousandths or wobble or run out. I'm going to mark spot on the saw where it moves the most in that one direction, which would be towards the board side. And I'm going to mark where I zeroed out the indicator. So those really are the two, how do we want to put that? They're the two extreme points, even though it's not very extreme. So this saw is wobbling a total of 10 thousandths, which means what we would call plus or minus 5 thousandths. So that means the saw moves 5 thousandths in each direction, and 5 thousandths is usually a sheet of paper is between 4 and 5 thousandths thick. So that's how much this saw moves back and forth. So let's talk about what should a finished saw look like. And it's a pretty good description that fits them all. And that is to say that it should be flat on the log side, have an acceptable amount of wobble, and the right amount of tension in the right location. So let's talk about what that means. First of all, this is the log side of this saw. That makes it a right-handed saw. Had it been a left-handed saw, I would turn it around and put it on the other way, so the log side would still be over here, but it would be facing the other direction. So every saw has a log side and a board side. Why do they need to be flat on the log side? Because we want the saw to run as straight as possible. If this saw had zero tension or zero stretch, and it was flat on the log side, when we run it up to speed and we start sawing with it, the action of sawing is going to stretch the rim of the saw. So that means the circumference would actually stretch and get a little bit longer. We know that 3.14 or pi times the diameter equals the circumference. So if we change the circumference, we didn't change the diameter, and we didn't change pi, we no longer have a circle. So what would happen if the saw had zero tension or zero stretch, as we tried to saw with it, that stretch that would happen at the rim due to resistance and a little bit of heat at the rim, the saw would take on the shape of a potato chip, and it would start a slow, snaky weave like that, and it just would not saw properly. So my job, the tensioning portion of my job, is to stretch the body of this saw to compensate for the amount of stretch that's going to happen at the rim. So now we're going to change the lighting a little bit, and I want to do a quick talk about the lighting. So right now we're under what we would call normal lighting conditions. Lighting for saw hammering looks more like this. Now with this work level lighting, when I put the straight edge on the anvil, you probably could see light under each end. You could see the crown shape in that anvil possibly, hopefully. And what you're looking at is only a 1/2 thousandths per inch. Remember, a sheet of paper is 5 thousandths, so you're able to see a 1/2 thousandths per inch of crown in that anvil, which you're only able to see from this weird lighting. Otherwise, it looks flat. So that's the lighting that we're going to look at the saw with. So I've marked the two extreme points of the wobble. I'd say extreme, there's only 10 thousandths difference between them, but still they're the extreme points. So I'm going to check at the X because that's the part that would be the farthest that way. Now, given the lighting, you'll never see perfection here because my saying is show me something that's perfect and I'll show you something you didn't check close enough. But this is considered flat on the log side. This would be dished towards the log side. This would be dished towards the board side. This is flat on the log side. And now we're going to check the tension in the saw real quick. Just again, this is to give you an idea of where we're trying to go on a trip. Because you got it planned ahead. Now I'm also going to show you in the process the proper method for checking tension. Some of the old guys years ago, they just did that to check the tension, that was good enough. Well, again, like I said earlier, every time the saw's in your hands, you kind of want to give it a shake and get a feel for what it feels like, but that's just one part of the equation. You need to know the whole thing. I mean, it's important, but there are other things you got to check. So, to check tension, what I'm looking for is flexibility and drop. So I'm going to do that with a 48-inch straight edge, and I'm not really trying to measure the tension with this as much as verify that it is a positive tension as opposed to a negative tension. So what I'm going to do is to check tension, the saw needs to be suspended at both rims, meaning suspended here, 12 o'clock, and suspended here at 6 o'clock. And the eye has to be in the air, has to be free. So my hip suspends it here. And what you see is there is positive drop. Next, I want to know not only how much tension, but where the tension is, because that's very important. What I want is the eye to be relatively flat, and then I want the bulk of the tension about an inch past halfway. In other words, if you go halfway between the collar line and the guide line, I want to be about an inch past halfway. So what I do is I put the straight edge on the eye, I suspend the saw in the tension checking position. I don't want it to rock there, and I don't want a big drop to a 12-inch straight edge. And then I slide this out, and I'm looking for where's the bulk of the light. And the bulk of the light is right about there. And it's nice to check in more than one place, because you also want even tension. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is measure the amount of tension. And that I'll do with a tension gauge. So we know by using the 12-inch straight edge our tension's in the right spot, and now we want to check and see if we have enough tension. So I use both sides of this tension gauge. That's the side that's the lower speed, the 7,500 to 8,500, and it's showing just a little bit of light, just about what I want to see there. This is the side that's 9,500, 10,500, and the gauge is rocking in this area. That means there's not enough tension to run 9,500 surface feet per minute, or not enough stretch, which is good because we're not running 9,500 surface feet per minute, we're running 8,100. So this gauge is working right, and it's showing that we have the right amount of tension at 8,100 surface feet per minute. Okay, so that's the tension gauge part. That is a saw that's properly hammered. We can put it back in the crate, and then we'll get a fresh one out of the pile, clean it up, and check it, see how it looks different from this saw, and then we'll make it look the same as this saw. Okay. Put this in the done rack, and we'll go get another one out of the to-do pile. Now let's try this one. So this saw is a 50-inch saw running 660 RPM, so that's 8,600 surface feet per minute. So that's a little more speed than the last one, not a lot, just a little more. Generally the tension feels most likely okay. I say most likely. If the saw's bent real bad, by the time it gets straight it's going to change some anyway. So, but it just gives me an idea so far what we have to work with. So now we're going to clean it. And then this is just a wire cut brush. Really, my job is to undo whatever happened to the saw last. So I look for clues as I'm cleaning the saw. And one of the clues I see is it looks like the guide line got really hot. Now the guides aren't really supposed to touch the saw, but when accidents happen, they do. And I could tell it got hot enough to change the color of the metal there a little bit. So I'm going to kind of file that away and see what that has to do with what I see in the rest of the saw when I inspect it. Zero out the dial indicator and then tighten with a wrench and see if there's any abnormal change there. Not a big deal, a couple thousandths. That'll work. In other words, nothing there that I need to worry about. Now I'm going to see how much wobble the saw has, or run out. I guess run out's a nicer term. Doesn't look too bad. I'm going to mark the two extreme points. Zero out the dial indicator. So it looks like it moves a total of 20 thousandths, what I would call plus or minus 10. So the run out is acceptable, and now we'll find out about the rest of it. The other thing I try to do is I take notice of the teeth, and I can tell by looking at these teeth that the angle's a little blunter than it should be. And I'm also going to look at the squareness of the teeth, and they look downright awful. So that surface should be perfectly square with the blade, and it's not. You can see it's at an angle, which means that would make the blade want to pull this way. My guess is, without even checking it, the blade's probably dished towards the board side, and maybe they tried to compensate by pulling it this way. My guess is, by what I'm seeing, the only reason this saw is here is because it's not sharpened correctly, and it's not running correctly because of the way it's sharpened. And somebody at the mill assumed that it's not running correctly because it needs to be hammered properly. Well, not the case. In fact, that's flat enough on the log side to suit me. I think what we have here is a saw that does not need to be hammered. It's a saw that needs the teeth to be sharpened properly. But let's check the tension real quick and make sure that's the case, because I could find something really wrong in the tension, and then that would change the whole thing. Occasionally that happens where they'll ship a saw in that, or bring it in either way, that looks fine, but it doesn't run right for them. So the question is, why doesn't it run right? So in this case, it took me 2 seconds looking at the teeth to figure out that saw's not going to run right with a teeth like that. And now it'll be up to me to contact the mill and say, listen, not only did I not charge you for hammering the saw, because I didn't need to hammer it, but if you want the saw to run properly, somebody's got to figure out how to sharpen it properly. But again, I'm reserving that judgment until I check the tension. But what I gathered by feeling the tension is that it's probably going to show it's okay. But let's see. And keep an open mind. So it passes that test okay. It does have positive tension. Tension looks okay to me, so that's a saw that doesn't need any work. Go figure. So there's your extreme point. Notice it's not diametrically opposed to the other extreme point, which it doesn't have to be, but it's nicer if it is. And that's at 28, so that's plus or minus 14 thousandths, which from a wobble standpoint is acceptable. Now, what you see here is a saw that's fairly severely dished towards the board side. If it was straight, it would look like that. If it was dished towards the log side, it would look like that, but it's dished towards the board side. I'd say severely, not severely enough that it shows a serious accident, but severely enough that it just needs to be fixed. And that's what I do. So let's fix it. Now, part of saw hammering is a strategic game. We know where we're trying to get to, and now we know what the saw looks like. We know that it's got workable tension, but maybe a little shy. And the wobble is okay, but the saw is bent towards the board side. So I want to develop a strategy as to how I want to go about fixing it. Now I can use the stretcher roll as a straightener instead of as a tensioner, and straighten in those areas with it. And if I do that, it won't change the tension any. Well, if the saw already had plenty of tension, that would be a good way to go. In this case, I think the saw is a hair low on tension, so instead of straightening with stretcher roll, I'll straighten it with the hammer, and the collateral damage of straightening with a hammer is it'll gain a little bit of tension. So I guess laziness is the mother of invention. If you can do two things at once, why not? So. Three things can happen when you hit a high spot with a hammer. Either a spot goes down, or it goes so far down that it goes through the other side, or that it laughs at you because you didn't hit hard enough. So one of those three things just happened, and now all I gotta do is figure out which one and proceed accordingly. So that went down, as did that, as did that. Now when I tap it at the rim, that's also going to tend to pull a little tension out of it because you're stretching the rim, but I'm really going to tap it pretty lightly, so I don't think it's going to be an issue. If I had to move it farther, I wouldn't do it this way. I would take it over on a stretcher roll. Still have plenty of tension. So our extreme point has changed a little bit, which is nice because now it's diametrically opposed from the other extreme. But there's still this section here, which doesn't come all the way back to zero, but it's pretty close to zero, so we still have kind of a little flutter going on here. But given that we're in spec for how many thousandths run out, it's something you just kind of have to leave the way it is. And part of the reason is if you tried to change it, you would change it by moving this way or moving that way, and they're so close together that one's going to come along for the ride with the other, and you're not going to fix it. Flat on the log side. So I say we ship that saw. So I have that on record.
Is hammering a saw something that's a part of routine maintenance, or is it something that really only happens when you have a mistake?
It's a good question. I guess the question is, how often should saws be hammered, and is it something after so many board feet you should hammer them? And it's different with band saws. Band saws, every time they're sharpened,
right,
you're removing metal off of the rim of the saw. That removing metal changes the tension in the body of the saw. Therefore, every time a band saw is sharpened, it also should be benched and hammered, or at least checked, and chances are benched. With a circular saw, because these are inserted teeth, Sharpening them doesn't change the tension of the saw, and even replacing them doesn't change the tension, although replacing the shanks does change the tension. But that you're going to do maybe once a year, maybe. So because of that, there's no preventive maintenance as far as hammering the saw is concerned. When it needs to be hammered is when it needs to be hammered. As far as routinely sending it out to get hammered once a year, wasted motion. Now, what causes the saw to need hammering is another question. And it's a pretty long answer, but having the teeth not sharpened accurately will cause the saw to need hammering sooner instead of later. Not sharpening the teeth often enough will make the saw run harder and cause it to need hammering sooner instead of later. Anytime you get heat in a saw, that's gonna put it in the direction of needing hammering. Basically, they only need to be hammered when they need to, and unfortunately, not all sawyers are able to recognize when that is. And then the other thing is, well, one would think if the saw isn't running right, it needs to be hammered. Well, that sounds good, but maybe the saw isn't running right because the teeth aren't sharpened right, or because something's wrong with the collars. So it's sometimes it's a tough call.
So when the saw is not running correctly, what will people observe and what's happening to the logs?
Good question. When the saw's not running properly, most of the time it'll start heating, and that'll create a wobble. And it'll run into the cut or out of the cut, and that'll create unsaleable lumber. Sometimes they don't notice any of these things until somebody sends a load of lumber back.
Right.
But other times, some sawyers, I mean, as soon as that saw does anything funny, there's, oh, we got a problem. And then he'll look at the sharpening and, you know, maybe check out the rest of the mill. It could kind of go either way. So this saw is slightly dished towards the board side. Tension feels good to me. Has acceptable amount of run out. So since the tension feels good to me and it's dished towards the board side, the plan I would devise for this saw would be, instead of straightening it by the hammer, straightening it by using a hammer, which will add tension to the saw that I don't think the saw needs. Instead, I'm going to use my leveling retrofit on my stretcher roll to straighten the saw so that it'll straighten the saw without changing the tension. So all I have to do is figure out where I want to straighten it, or what the high spot is, so to speak, because the saw is dished towards the board side. And so I found my high spot. I only marked it here, but it goes all the way around. And I've got my stretcher roll set in the leveling position so that it will level or straighten the saw. And all we're going to do is squeeze it. This is called saw hammering without violence. And again, the reason for this is, number one, I'm not leaving any hammer marks on the saw, which is nice, but I'm also not altering the tension at all. So when you hit a high spot with a hammer, the only way that lump can go down is that metal has to stretch for the lump to go down. When you do it with a stretcher roll, instead of stretching it to get it to go down, you're just bending it to get the lump to go down. And as a result, you're not changing the tension any. This one probably went through a little bit. I'll check it closer on the test arbor, but I think it probably did go through a little bit, which is okay because we can bring it back. And again, we can bring it back by using the stretcher roll so that we're not gaining tension. Because when you level with a hammer, if it goes through and then you got to bring it back, each time it's gaining tension. And once you take it back and forth a couple of times, next thing you know, you got way too much tension in the saw. So that can be an issue. Well, we not only didn't make the wobble any worse, it actually got better by quite a bit. Not necessarily on purpose, although what I do try to do on purpose is try to work in a way that it won't get worse. Since it was already really good, I didn't need to improve it, but on its own it improved. So it's now plus or minus about 4 thousandths, which is not a lot of wobble to say the least. But the saw is now dished towards the log side. It was dished towards the board side, and now it's dished towards the log side. So I'll have to bring it back that way a little bit, and that'll give me an opportunity for the wobble or the run out to get a little bit worse, because it ain't going to get any better at plus or minus 4 thousandths. But again, because I'm, instead of stretching to get the lump to go down, I'm just bending, I can bend it back and forth all day long, and it's not going to alter the tension any, which is why I use that stretcher roll in that situation. So now we're going to work on the board side. And again, same process, just find the high spot, or the highest high spot. And this time, because I know I squeezed it just a little too hard last time, I'm going to try and squeeze it a little less hard. This method's also easier on the ears. And that says to me that I didn't squeeze it hard enough, so that's okay. We'll hit her again. Needs a little more. Well, the rough check says it's at least close enough to warrant a trip to the test arbor to get a good check for it. $10 to 15 thousandths. So I need to just pull it this way a little bit. And that's almost the hardest part of hammering saws. When the saw is bent real bad, it's easy to move at a big distance. But when it's just slightly bent a little bit, to move it a very short distance, sometimes it's harder than moving it a big distance. Now this saw is just a hair high in the eye, and I mean just a hair. So I'm going to fix it now by just tapping it in the eye. Some of the old saw doctors would say you should never hit a saw in the eye. That's the center of the saw. And it is true, you really don't want to hit it with a hammer on the collar line, because the collar has to squeeze against that. But if it's high right here on the bore, that needs to be flat there. And yeah, you don't want to get crazy and beat it up real bad, but it needs to be straight. Everything radiates out from here. On a 56-inch saw, 5 thousandths here is 50 thousandths out on the rim. So. What you don't want to do, if you hit it one time too light, don't think you can go back in and just wail on it, because even if you hit it too light, it knows you hit it. Okay, let's give that a check on the test arbor. So that's all done.
Great, great.
So this saw is all done. I've put a protective coat of WD-40 on it, so that it hopefully won't rust in the future either. And now I'm going to put it back in its crate and say goodbye to it, even though I'm sure I'll see it again.